Nazir Daf Dalid continues commenting on our last Mishnah. We're first going to focus on Tumas Hatahom, which is when somebody crosses over or becomes Tameh, but he was not aware of it. What effect it has depending on where it is, if it's moving, if it's floating, if it's on the ground. The Gemara will have a list of shilas related to that. And then the Gemara will get into our next sugya, which is discussing what happens in a situation where Tuma happens when someone is Becheskas Tuma. What happens there, and we'll bring proofs to that from our last Mishnah as well. So let's begin. In our last Mishnah, we gave an example of Tumas Hatahom, where somebody went into the water and there was a mace floating on the water. So the Gemara discusses the properties of a mace that's floating. So the Gemara says that in our example, it was Tumas mace. It was a human corpse. That's where you could become Tameh, Tumas Hatahom, from a floating source of Tumah. However, Tumas Sheretz, which is a rodent, one of the 8 rodents that is Matame, if that's floating, it doesn't cause Tumah if you weren't aware of it at the time. And the Gemara quotes a brisa that shows that. The brisa says, if you have a suffix Tumah that's floating, so if it's floating in the ground, that it's floating on a body of water which is held in ground, there it's tahar for sure. But since it's floating, it's moving, it's not considered to be in a specific spot. The Gemara will show shortly that there's a gzeras hakasav, that there is no issue there. It's suffix is tahar. Now, if, however, it's floating in a kli, you have water that's held in a vessel, and it's floating in that, there you have a machokas. The Tanakama holds that that is also tahar, and Rav Shimon holds that that case it's tameh, even though it's a suffix and it's a sheret. Even though it's a suffix sheret, it's floating, it's tameh if it's in a kli. So Gemara says, what's the reason for all this? So the Gemara quotes psukim. So the Tanakama, the Gemara quotes of Yitzchak bar Avudim, who says both a kli and in ground water it is tahar, a suffix is tahar, derived as follows. The pasuk says, "B'chol sheretz hashoretz," any creepy crawly which is crawly. Now, the fact that it says sheretz hashoretz seems to indicate that wherever it is, any place that it is, on the ground, in the water, any place where you find it, it's matame. However, then it says al ha'oretz, which implies it's only if it's on the ground. So which is it, in the water, or even in the water, or only on the ground? So therefore, the Chachamim, the Tanakama, say you have to have a split halacha. If it's a vadai, if you touched it vadai, it's matame wherever it is. If you touched it safek, then you only have to go chumrah if it's on the ground, and not if it's on the water. And there is no chilik between in a kli or in the water or in ground held water, whatever it is. You still have this halacha. Now, Rav Shimon holds a little bit differently. He looks at the next pasuk, which says, Ach mayon ubar mikveh mayim yeh tahar. A source of water is tahar. Somebody touches their corpse will become tameh. So which is it? The water is tahar or it's tameh. So he says you have to have a split in here also. As water in the ground is going to be tahar, but water in a kli will be tameh. All right, now the Gemara moves on to discuss more circumstances in what the state of the source of tumah is. The Gemara quotes a brisa that says if you have a tumah that's being dragged or that's being held, and even though it's moving, so it's like it's floating, its suffix is tameh, because since it's being held by something, it's being dragged and held, or it's being held and being moved through the air. Since it's being held, it's considered to be in a still place, and it's not considered to be like it's loose and floating in the air. It's considered grounded in the person that's holding it, and therefore their suffix is tameh. Now, if it is flying, though, that it was thrown, that's considered to be tahar because it's like floating. The exception to that is a type of tumah where the tumah extends upwards and downwards from wherever it is. So that's a kezayis from a dead body, or tumas oel, where it's within a roof. There it's considered to fill up the entire space above and below, and therefore it's considered to be stationary. It's like it's on the ground that it's in. Even though it's flying, it's considered to be that it's on the ground, because its tumah extends all the way up and all the way downwards if you're talking about a mace, and if you're talking about an ohel. And that's true for anything which extends upwards and downwards. And the Gemara says that's to include a zav and a zava. They also have their tum extend upwards and downwards, because a zav and a zava who sit on something, everything underneath them is tameh as well. All right, now the Gemara has a question introduced by Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama asks a question which is going to lead to a series of imtim slimers. If you paskin this, what do you say in the next case, the next case, and the next case? So he asks, if you have a mace, you have a body that is Pashas referring to a sheretz, and it's in a kli, and the kli is floating. What do you say there? Do you say, well, the sheretz is stationary in the kli, or do you look at the kli and say that the kli is floating? What do you say on that? Now, if you want to say that you look at the kli and you view the entire thing as if it's floating, so what if the mace is on a sheretz? What if you have a tumas mace and it's on a sheretz that is, mace is tumas shiva, makes someone tummy for 7 days, and a sheretz only makes someone tummy for 1 day. So what do you say there? Do you say that it's all considered to be tuma, it's all tuma sources, and therefore you view it as one large pile of tuma that's floating? Or do you say, since it's two different types of tuma, one is tuma for 7 days and one is a tuma only until sundown, therefore the tuma that's on 7 days is sitting in something with a lower level of tuma, and it's like it's considered to be in a kli, and you view it as if it is resting in the kli. Now, if you want to say that you view it as if it's in a kli, and therefore it is tameh. So what would be if you have a sheretz on top of a nevela, and the nevela is floating? Do you say that here they're both the same, and therefore I could view it as one big piece of tumah that's floating? Or do you say, no, they have different shiurim? One is a shir concise, one is a shir adasha. Since they have different halachos, it's viewed as separate entities, and therefore the top one is resting on the bottom one, and the bottom one is the one that's floating. Now, what would you say if you had a sheretz on top of another sheretz? There, it's the same halacha, same shear, same length of tumah. So would you say there that it's considered to be one large tumah, or would you say it's separate entities? And therefore it's considered to be that the upper one is resting in the lower one, and the lower one is the one that's floating, but the upper one is not floating. And if you want to say that that is considered to be separate entities, what if the lower tumah is a liquid? What if you have nevela which is ground up or turned into mush, and you have a sheretz floating in that? So do you say that the upper one there is also floating? Or do you say no, because the upper one is considered to be one entity, and the lower one is, they are both considered to be like they are floating, because they're both food, they're both inedible. Now, if you want to say that you don't say that, what would be if it's the upper one is floating in shechlas zera? That's a liquid, but it's not inedible. So what would you say there? Is it considered to be the upper one is floating in the shechla zera, or do you say that it's considered to be one pile of tumah? Now, if you say that if you have a psak in that, maybe that's only because the zera came from a human. What would you say if it wasn't? What would you say if it was just paraduma water, which is metame? They have something floating in that. Would you say that the upper one is floating in the lower one? And all these, the Gemara says we don't know. It says le'yadiyim, we don't know. And teku, the question stands. Next, the Gemara moves on to another shaila. The Gemara discusses, what if you have someone who's becheskas tuma, and he has a situation of tumas tatom, he becomes tameh, and he finds out about the tuma later. So the Gemara quotes Rav Hamnuna, and he says, if you have a Nazir and somebody who's doing a korban Pesach, and they are both traveling, and they step on a kever hatahom, that is a tumah that they could not have known about, and they're both on the last day of their tumah. That is, they were both tamei mace. They're both on day number 7. One is on his way to bring a korban Pesach, and the other is on his way to finish his nazirus, and therefore he's trying to end off his nazirus b'tahara. And what happens is that they both continue and they do their thing. This guy brings a korban Pesach, and the other one finishes his nazirus b'tumah, starts as nazirus b'tahara, and finishes that. After all that, they then find out that they were tameh on day 7. So what do you say there? Do you say that the Tumas at the home is too weak at this point to uproot what they've accomplished already. It can't mess up the Korban Pesach that they did, and it can't mess up the Naziris that they finished. Or do you say no? Because they were Becheskas Tomei, Tumas at the home is strong when it applies to someone who is Tomei already. They were Tomei at that point. They were trying to be a Metayer. So Tumas at the home, you find out about it later, is strong enough to mess you up if you were Becheskas Tomei. So Rav Hamnuna says this is not going to mess you up. That's how he wants to paskin, and Tumas at the home is not strong enough. Rava asks, if you look in the Mishnah says in the case of Tumas at the home, if he was becheskas tamei, it is matami. He had the Nazir who went into the water, and he met a floating Tumas at the home, or Tumas at the home which was in the bottom of the water. Then it is matami because he was becheskas tamei. So that shows that you're wrong. So the Gemara says, Rav Hamnuna said, no, I wasn't saying it in case of a Nazir. I agree with you in the case of a Nazir. I was only talking about the Korban Pesach guy. What's the difference? The difference is that the Nazir has to still do a haircut to be a Matahar. So he's missing some actions. So you can't say that it's like he's already Tahar. He's still in his Tumah state. The Korban Pesach guy, he doesn't need anything. He's on his way to bring the Korban Pesach. He's up to day number 7. He doesn't have anything left to do. So therefore, it's not considered like it's becheskas tamei, and he's okay. So Abaya asks, that's not true, because the Korban Pesach also has to wait for the sun to go down. And he's not tahar yet until the sun goes down. He's on day 7, even though he already sprinkled, but the sun has to go down. So that he answered, the sun going down is not considered to be something that you have to do. It goes down by itself, and it's not something that's considered to be holding back, and therefore the Tumas Atom can't mess you up at that point. So the Gemara says that Abaya also changed and agreed with this idea that the sun going down is not considered to be something left to be done. The Gemara shows that discussion, which is a discussion between Abaye and Rav Kahana on a brisa discussing a yoledes, a woman who gives birth. She enters days of tahara and then days of tumah. If she gave birth to a boy, it's 40 days. If it's a girl, she has 80 days. And the tumah ends at the end of those days. And she has to bring a karbanos then. So the halacha is, what happens if she has another hapala, she has a miscarriage, within the 40 days or the 80 days? So if she has it within the 40 days or the 80 days, she doesn't have to bring a second carbon for that second birth, the second miscarriage, which has the halacha of a birth. But if it happens on the last day, then she does. She has to bring another one. The Brisa goes further and says that if she had 3, and the third one was within the days of the second one, and the second one was within the days of the first one, but the third one was not within the days of the first one, still, you don't have to bring 2 karbanis, even though the third one was not within the days of the first one, because it was within the days of the second one, you don't have to bring another carbon, and we learned that out from a pasuk where it says, Uvemelois yemei tahara. Only on the day, bimelois, the last day, does she have to bring another one. If it's within the days, you don't have to. Says Rav Kahana, what's the reason? Because on the last day, you're in the time when you're not lacking anything anymore. The previous days, you're still lacking a carbon. The carbon's bought on the last day. But on the last day, you're not lacking anything. And on that, there was a question that was asked that, what do you mean you're still lacking the sun going down? And if I answer the sun going down is not considered to be a lack because it happens by itself, is not something you need to do. So you see that Abaya did agree to this svara ultimately.